Hey, AP Environmental Science. It is me, Miss Willis, and I am here to talk to you today about acid deposition, which is commonly known as acid rain, but it includes so much more. So let's get into the details and go ahead and get started. When we talk about acid deposition, of course, you need to know a little something about the pH scale, right? So the pH scale is used to measure how acidic or basic a solution is, and it's based on a log scale. So 0 to 6 on the pH scale means that you are an acid. If you are a 7, you measure a 7, that means you're neutral, and 8 to 14 is a base. Each step on the pH scale increases its strength by a power of 10, but it's a little tricky because as you go from an 8 to a 14 is actually the strongest base that's possible. However, it works in the opposite direction on the acid side. So a 1 acid is much stronger than a 6 acid. So for example, if you were looking at something with a pH of 8 and a pH of 9, the pH of 9 is 10 times stronger than the pH of 8. So just remember that every level you go up or down increases its strength by 10. Now, normal rainwater is slightly acidic, and it has a pH of about 5 to 6, so it ranges. And this is because of the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. So it mixes with the water that's in the air, and it makes H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. So that's what causes the slightly acidic nature of rainwater. But when we're talking about acid rain, well, acidic rain has a pH of about 3 to 4, so it's definitely much stronger than just normal rainwater. And that's caused by two different chemicals. So we're going to talk about sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides that contribute to the acidic deposition that is here on Earth. The first way that acid deposition can be created is from sulfur dioxide. So as you probably remember from our outdoor air pollution talk, sulfur dioxide is created primarily from coal burning, and it can also be released from volcanoes. So when that coal is burned, it releases sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and again, it mixes with water to make a very strong acid called sulfuric acid, H2SO4. This is a secondary air pollutant because remember, it's mixing with something that's already in the atmosphere to make a new chemical. So this sulfuric acid has a very low pH of about 3, and it can cause a lot of problems. Another way that acid deposition can be created is from nitrogen dioxide. And nitrogen dioxide comes from two huge sources. Number one, gasoline burning. So that happens a lot here in Los Angeles. And of course, fertilizer application, because fertilizers do contain a lot of nitrogen. When they get laid down and exposed to oxygen, they obviously vaporize and can go into the atmosphere. So when those nitrogen dioxide molecules mix with water that's in the atmosphere, they make another type of acid called nitric acid, HNO3. Now you're starting to see why you have to take chemistry before you take AP Environmental Science. So this nitric acid, it's not as strong as sulfuric acid, but it does have a pH of about 4. So what are some of the effects of acid deposition? Well, let's take a look at those. So the first thing, if we're talking about buildings and human construction, acid deposition destroys limestone. Limestone is made of calcium carbonate. And so here's just a picture of something before that was made, and then after years of acidic deposition, you can see that it erodes away at the material. Here's another picture of the destruction from acid deposition. So you can see there, you can't really tell the face of the creature that was once created. It's been definitely eroded through the release of acid deposition. Another thing that happens with acid deposition is fish deaths. So fish, they live in waterways, as you know, and when acid is deposited in the lake, it can create acidic water in the waterway. Well, fish species, they can really only tolerate certain pHs and certain pH ranges. So if you change those pH ranges, either making it too acidic or even too basic, it can cause massive fish kills in a waterway. I like this diagram here because it does show that some species can tolerate those pH changes, but some cannot. So if you go into an acidic waterway and you notice that the water is maybe a pH of 4, you're going to see that the diversity of the waterway is going to be quite low because there are very few organisms that can actually tolerate those low pHs as you see here in the picture. The same thing happens with plants. Plants can only tolerate certain pH ranges. And so if you do have acid rain that falls onto the soil and the soil becomes acidic, those plants cannot tolerate that acidic soil. So why is this a problem for us? Well, it can lead to agricultural productivity losses. So that means maybe we aren't able to grow as much food as we need as a society. When trees are exposed to continual acid deposition, it does damage their leaves and the tree bark. And that is a problem because, as you know, leaves are photosynthetic machinery. So if they have damaged leaves, they can't perform as much photosynthesis as they may need. And also that damage to the bark, well, that's kind of like the tree's main protection. So it does offer very little resistance to pests. One of the things that you may have learned in chemistry is when you apply an acid to a metal compound, so something that contains a metal but it's a compound, that acid will cause the compound to break apart and the metals will become free floating or they're free in the environment. Well, why is that a problem? Well, if these metals are free floating in the environment, organisms like fish can take them up. So they can accumulate metals into their system and it can lead to metal toxicity in fish. And again, the same thing happens with plants. So in plants, if this acid deposition falls on the soil, it causes these metal compounds to break up and become ionic. Those metals that are free floating in the soil that can be taken up by plants and cause metal toxicity in the plants as well. And another thing that's bad with that is something called soil leaching that happens. So you apply this acid to a soil, it breaks up those metal compounds, and when they're broken up and they're not taken up by plants or in a waterway by a fish, if it rains, then those, or any kind of irrigation, any kind of water comes along, it will wash away those nutrients. So it leads to a loss of nutrients in the soil because they are leached out by water. And so here's a map of the United States, and you might notice that the East Coast has higher levels of acid deposition than in any other place of the United States. So again, ask yourself, why is this occurring in the East Coast? Well, the East Coast does do a lot of coal burning to supply their electrical needs. And as you burn coal, it releases sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That mixes with the water and it makes the very strong acidic rain, sulfuric acid, that is deposited on the East Coast. That's a little different than the West Coast because, like I said, we get a lot of our energy from natural gas burning. We're getting our acid deposition from that nitric acid that's being created from gasoline burning. So the pH isn't as strong as what you're seeing on the East Coast. And lastly, how do we control this acid acid deposition? Well, one great way to control acid deposition is to stop releasing sulfur dioxides and nitrogen dioxides into the atmosphere. So how do you reduce those emissions? Well, you have to switch to alternative energies. So instead of using coal burning for electrical purposes, you can switch to solar panels or hydroelectric power. Both of those don't release sulfur or nitrous oxide emissions in their operations. We also created laws like the Clean Air Act, which regulates how much nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides are allowed to be emitted by industries. These standards were set in something called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and their standards and levels pretty much that industries have to follow and make sure that they don't exceed, or else they'll get fined by the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, everyone. Well, that concludes our talk on acid deposition, and I will see you soon.